I shortened the title to Art Embodied, but at some risk. The original title, which was a little more prolix, helped to distinguish my target from others that might be called embodied art in the literature. So you might be interested in art forms that are characteristically embodied in the sense of involving movement, so something like dance. You might be interested in art forms that represent parts of the body, so the collaboration, Carballo-Farman created these replicas using computer three-dimensional imaging technology of tumors, malignant tumors, and you can see an instance of one of them in the corner. And during the break, I hope you'll all look at the embodied art exhibition that's in this space right now. You might be interested in art that causes us to have strong embodied reactions in the form of empathy or maybe physical movement. So there's a research program associated with people like Vittorio Gallese and David Friedberg that look at how when we look at images of the body in motion, or in this case the body in pain, as Thomas drives his finger into the wound of Christ, people experience a response that mirrors, that echoes what they're looking at in the picture. These are all approaches to art through embodiment. Mine is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to talk about the way that the body, and more specifically the way emotions, contribute to judgment of art, the appraisal of art is good or bad. I'm going to begin by surveying some work in neuroscience. I'm going to be actually super brief here because I want to try and catch up on some lost time. But I will have occasion to revisit some of this material in the end. So this is a Shuzu and Zeki slide showing people making judgments of beauty in looking at pictures. And they see that as compared to ugliness judgments, beauty is associated with an increased neural activation in an area called the subgenual cingulate, also parts of the medial orbital frontal cortex. So we're going to come back to some of this phrenology and come back to these brain areas. And for now, I'm just going to say something very, very simplistic, which is that this is an area that comes up frequently in studies having to do with emotion. And just out of brevity, I'll sort of say the same about some of these other slides. So this is some DOI data looking at responses in various areas, including the amygdala and the insula, when people look at images that are considered to be aesthetically good as opposed to, in some way, aesthetically disturbing. And if you actually look at this slide, that's a big activation in the motor cortex. That's when looking at an image that's aesthetically disturbing. It's an image of a distorted body as opposed to an ideal bodily form in a Greek sculpture. So reward center activity for the ideal form, motor response for the distorted form, maybe as if you're trying to get away from that ugly image. Here is Vartanian and Goel, who were sort of pioneers in the neuroscience of art using fMRI. And what you can see, these are three different brain structures here. And you can see that's the caudate, which is part of the basal ganglia associated with learning, but also with aspects of motor control. You can see that there, as a work becomes less liked, you see a decrease in caudate activation. And you see increases in preference activation. So this is, these are areas of the visual system. So you see a visual increase when people like a picture. You also see an increase here in anterior cingulate. Again, part of the same structure we saw on that first slide. Another example, here a recent study had people look at these Rembrandt paintings, and they were told either that they were real paintings or forgeries. And you can see an orbital frontal activation here associated with being told the picture is real, being told that it's authentic. And these are areas that have been associated with reward. So again, structures that are associated with emotion. It's not always just emotion. So for instance, you see in looking at good pictures some activity in these interparietal areas that are associated with attention. So there seems to be an increase in attention. And again, this is a meta-analysis of aesthetic preference judgments across different sensory modalities that was recently conducted. And you can see basically a litany of areas that if you're a person who's a student of cognitive neuroscience, you'll recognize as associated with emotion. So the main moral I just want to draw from this super fast survey is that emotion areas have been implicated in studies of aesthetic response in the brain. So, and that brings us to a question, what exactly are emotions? Emotions aren't clearly not just hot spots in the brain. They're much more complex. But one aspect of emotions that I think is very important and relevant for our conference was originally brought to popular attention by this guy. So this is William James. And James, back in 1890, said that the experience of an emotion, the feeling you have when you have an emotion, is the experience of your body undergoing a transformation. The body goes under these transformations that are basically conducive to action. So if you encounter something that's threatening, your body prepares for aggression or for flight. If you encounter something that is lost to you, something that you value that's been taken away, your body might prepare for withdrawal or conservation of energy. If you achieve a goal, your body prepares for exploration, for activity. And if somebody insults you, you might again prepare for aggression. If you induce a contaminant, your body prepares for rejection. So all of these emotions, disgust, anger, happiness, sadness, can be thought of as involving stereotypical bodily patterns that are in some way conducive to coping in a very embodied way with these kinds of life events. And when you have an experience of an emotion, you experience your body reacting. And there's been a tremendous amount of support for this picture that is associated with William James, so we'll make James smile. And that support has come now from decades of work in behavioral psychology, but it's also been coming from neuroscience. So, for example, this is a slide from work by Hugo Critchley exploring interoception, just people's perception of bodily changes. Nothing to do with emotion in this study, and you can see our friends like anterior cingulate and insula, classic areas that show up in emotion studies, also some somatosensory areas which crop up as well, being important to perception of the body. If you look at studies that show the brain perceiving the body and studies that show the brain reacting emotionally, they're very hard to tell apart. So we have evidence that the body is being used as a source of information in the domain of value. You look at a picture, you want to know whether you like it, you feel how your body is reacting to it. Is it something you want to approach, something you want to flee from? In this context, it's worth really as a footnote in the spirit, I think, of especially Alva's presentation, but also Linda's, to remark that there's an old dichotomy between input and output. And if you read the James idea, the theory that emotions are perceptions of changes in the body, it looks like a very input side idea. But if you actually study the neuroscience of body perception, there's some evidence that the structures that are involved in perception of the body are also involved in body regulation. I won't give you detail on this slides, but this is another one from Critchley's group, looking at patients who have difficulty with body regulation. Basically, they can't adjust their heart rate when they're engaged in things like physical exercise. And the structures, the lesions that lead to these deficits are also the ones that are involved in body perception. And the same is true of the insula. It does look like the input-output dichotomy is not that easy to maintain in the nervous system when we're looking at bodily perception and control. So I think the upshot of all of this is that emotions are embodied in two ways. They involve perception of the body, but they also involve control of the body. When you're in an emotional state, you're in a state of bodily perception and regulation. Now, if we want to talk about the role of emotion in aesthetics, we need to move beyond this simple claim that aesthetic judgments are emotional and figure out which emotions are involved. And this is a difficult and incomplete task, but I want to say a little bit about it because it's been an issue of considerable interest in the history of philosophy. Philosophers in the room will surely recognize this guy. Who is it? Kant, yeah. And how many of you can recognize this one? Anyone? So this is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was a major figure in the history of economics and conservative thought, but also a major figure in the history of aesthetics, wrote a tremendously important book in the 18th century on the sublime, a book whose ideas are really a source, really in steady correspondence in terms of their theoretical issues with the important work that Kant did on aesthetics. But the aesthetics of Burke and the aesthetics of Kant differ in an important respect. They posit a different emotion at the heart, so to speak, of aesthetic responsiveness. So for Kant, aesthetic response involves a kind of disinterested pleasure. It's a pleasure response that involves a separation from ourselves and our own particular goals and interests, but it's a pleasure we take in looking at artworks. For Burke, it's a very different emotion. It's fear. So Burke, who's very interested in the sublime, thinks the greatness of art is somehow terrifying to us. It instills dread. The more obscure work becomes, the larger it becomes, the more we find it to be sublime. And he thought this was at the heart of the emotional response to art. So we can have kind of a little slight creepy fear look and a creepier smile. So now, having gotten to an age where we can start to look at the aesthetic responsive agent in an empirical way, we can ask which, if either of these guys was right. And there's evidence that interestingly bears on both theories. And I want to begin with a study that directly tested Burke's view. And it was a study that Natalie Kasnick here in the psychology department here at Brooklyn College was involved with, and it was spearheaded by Kendall Eskin, who is at Loyola University in New Orleans. And the hypothesis was that you could increase people's sublimeness judgments by frightening them. Okay, so it was an emotion induction study. I'm going to show you a little film. Okay, so did anyone get scared? I never got scared of this. I remember Kendall coming and showing this to me in a cafe, and I was like,
Volume though?
yeah, it needs volume. I have the sound off. The volume is important. Do you want to hear with sound? Yeah, he screams.
I thought it was the landscape that was so creepy.
Yeah, I was a city boy, you know. I got to say, those winding country roads really creep me out. Anyway, we induced fear. So fear was induced using this startling film clip. Happiness was induced using images of babies. And I have the opposite. I have inverted. Zombies make me happy. Babies scare me. And then arousal was induced using exercise, and both intense arousal and more moderate arousal were induced by having people do jumping jacks, different number of jumping jacks, and then we showed people art. And we used these Lissitzky paintings. So for those of you who know Lissitzky, he was a kind of a constructivist artist who developed a system of abstraction that produced images like these, which turn out to be extremely good stimuli. I'm sure Lissitzky wasn't thinking of these as stims, but anyway, they are. And what's good about them is they tend to elicit fairly neutral ratings, you know. And what you can do is move those ratings around through emotion. And what Kendall and his collaborators found were that as compared to a control group, these arousal groups, both the low and the high physical arousal, where you're doing jumping jacks, and a happiness group, fear is the biggest impact. So fear is the one that really drives up sublimeness ratings of this work. To measure sublimeness, a scale was developed that used words like stirring, moving, words that are related to, oh, hi.
We got it covered, don't we, Jessica?
We're good? Okay.
Keep going.
Will you be able to get out during the...
Yeah.
I think we're going to need to clear a little path. Maybe we should we just
No,
pause for a
okay, I
minute?
got it, I got it.
No, don't worry about it.
Yep.
Fine.
Okay. Think of this as a kind of psychology experiment. It's an attention experiment.
So since you've been interpreted, so they were scared, and then they were shown the art.
And then they were shown.
They were
Yeah.
scared of the clip.
They were shared. So it's right. So it's a kind of
And
attribution
can you
study or
measure heart
transfer
rate or
study.
something for all of these?
We did no physiological measures. So
Can I answer
here,
something?
but yeah.
We did ask for self-reported physiological arousal, and the high exercise, the happy, and the fear self-reportedly, they all rated as feeling the same level of arousal.
So but it would be good to do the actual
We thought
physiology.
of doing that. In
It's, you know, people have done self-report in this domain. I mean, it tends to be pretty valid with respect to physiological arousal, but it would be good to do. But there's a problem here. So I think this work should be taken very seriously. It does suggest, quite surprisingly, I think, to intuition that fear may play a role in positive aesthetic response. So Burke might be right. But there's a problem, which is that the notion that fear simply inflates our judgment of all art is difficult to sustain. One way to think about this is intuitively, some pictures are sad. Some pictures are happy. Some pictures are disgusting. The kind of art we look at is often going to affect the emotions that are elicited. And the relevance of the emotional response we have may depend on what we're looking at. The neutral stimuli are sort of very good for the fear study because they don't have any emotional content. But what if you have images like these? What if you have images that are very sad? So, and this was a study with Angelica. Where did Angelica go? Oh, she's here. Okay. You're hiding in the corner. Angelica took these sad images and also some scary images and did an emotion induction, this time using music. So instrumental music is a particularly useful tool in doing emotion induction because it has no words, it has no lyrics, so there's no semantic content. People aren't necessarily thinking about some specific kind of thing. Their mood is just altered by hearing these sad sounds, hearing these frightening sounds. And then we had people do ratings of these pictures. And what we found, do I have a data slide? No, I don't have a data slide. What we found basically is that the sad music makes the sad pictures better, and the scary music makes the scary pictures better, but not conversely. So fear doesn't bring up the goodness of the sad pictures. And in fact, we got a little bit of what we're thinking about in terms of emotional dissonance. If you have a contrasting emotion to the one that's depicted, it can actually make people's judgment of the picture worse. So fear doesn't just always amplify aesthetic appraisal, it can sometimes bring it down. As a footnote here too, Angelica did another study, we did another study where we showed that the music can affect people's interpretation of pictures. So we showed people some ambiguous pictures, and we gave them sad music or frightening music concurrently, and then we gave them a multiple choice. So is this a picture of a crazed woman about to commit an act of vengeance, or is it a woman about to commit suicide? Is this a picture of some people at a funeral, or is it a picture of these sort of menacing figures about to abduct these innocent women on the balcony? Is this a picture of a couple that have just had a bad fight and they're breaking up, and one of them is moving out of the house, a case of loss or sadness, or is it a case of a murderer about to assail against his victim? So frightening interpretations, sad interpretations, and what we found is that the music drove the interpretation. So as compared to neutral music, if you look at, in this case, neutral music is being played, and we see no significant difference. I don't have error bars here. For how many psychologists in the room? I'm going to show you, oh shit, I'm going to show you no error bars and no p-values, so but you can get the data from us. And with the scary music, what you see is that the scary music increased the scary interpretations. So red is a scary interpretation. Scary music drove those up, and sad music drove up the sad interpretations. So music is playing a role in the interpretation of pictures. It's not always just playing a role in appraisal. So the simple story that says fear just makes all pictures better needs to be somewhat qualified. Moreover, there's a body of evidence that suggests another emotion can drive up appraisal. So in Kendall's study, we didn't see much movement with the induction of pleasure, of happiness. But there is other work suggesting that happiness can improve aesthetic rating. So for instance, Alice Eisen, the famous positive psychologist, major pioneering figure in positive psychology, had done a study years ago when she was at the University of Maryland, where she showed people photographs of the fairly ugly University of Maryland campus. I don't know if have any of you been in College Park? It's a vast sea of ugliness. And she showed people that no place should take so long to get from point to point and be that ugly. But it's full of these innocuous university buildings like this, and she asked people to rate them. But the manipulation was that half the participants found a dime on their seat when they came into the laboratory. And they'd say, oh, professor, there's a dime here. And she would say, well, it must have been from the last subject, but we protect anonymity here, so we couldn't trace that subject. I guess you'll have to keep it. And as many of you know, Eisen has also shown that a dime can make people something like 7 times more altruistic. A dime makes the world more beautiful as well. So judgments for these innocuous pictures increased as a function of the positive affect. And Angelica and I also did a version of this. We played not scary music, not sad music, but very pleasant, cheerful, uplifting music. A work by Grieg. We showed them fairly abstract works by Duchamp, Gorky, and Rothko for art people in the room, and the uplifting music as compared to control lifted aesthetic judgments there. So we're seeing two emotions that can move our aesthetic judgments. The solution might be to bring these two forces together. The solution might be to add Burke and Kant and get our theory of aesthetic emotion this way, and there's a long tradition of doing exactly this. So this is the face of what emotion? You should all recognize it. It's not an Ekman face, but it should be one. It's, of course, wonder. So in the 18th century, people were very, very interested in this emotion, wonder. Already in the 17th century, Descartes had listed it as the most fundamental emotion. It's an emotion that got a lot of attention in 18th century aesthetics and was thought to be very important to the appreciation of art. And one way to think about wonder is that it relates to this kind of combination of emotions that we've been talking about. Here's one definition of wonder that I happen to like. Can anyone recognize the dead white man? Anyone? Adam Smith. Okay. So you won't know this, but Adam Smith wrote a book on the aesthetics of science, in which he talks about wonder. And here's a fairly lengthy quote, but I think it's worth reading. When something quite new and singular is presented, imagination and memory exert themselves to no purpose, and in vain look around all their classes of ideas in order to find one under which it may be arranged. They fluctuate to no purpose from thought to thought, and we remain still uncertain and undetermined where to place it, or what to think of it. It is this fluctuation and vain recollection together with the emotion or movement of the spirits that they excite, which constitute the sentiment properly called wonder, and which occasion that staring and sometimes rolling of the eyes, that suspension of breath, that swelling of the heart. So wonder is this thing that takes your place away. He has a theory of what causes it, which, if anyone knows the third critique, it's basically the essence of Kant's account of beauty. It's an inability to apply one's ideas to the imagination, and you get a free play of the imagination that comes from the inability to fully grasp something under the concepts that you possess. It was already there in Adam Smith, and it's already there in the brain. So one way to think about wonder is that wonder has these elements that are a kind of positive emotion. It's related to pleasure. It might not feel pleasurable. It doesn't necessarily feel good. But it's positive, it's appetitive, it makes us want to seek things out, it makes us go into an approach mode. But it also has these elements that make us feel small and worried, a little anxious. It's a kind of anxious pleasure. And if we go back to this brain slide, we can think about attention as very central to wonder. Wonder is a kind of positively valence attention. But there are also these elements that are fear-like. And if you look at these areas like the subgenual cingulate, one of the first discoveries about subgenual cingulate is it pops up in anticipatory anxiety. So it's associated with fear response. Interior insula is associated with negative emotions quite broadly, but shows up in a lot of fear studies. But then you get the nucleus accumbens. You get, for brain people in the room, this is like reward central, right? And these medial orbital frontal areas show up in reward studies as well. So you get this combination of fear-like and pleasure-like responses here manifesting themselves in the brain. So wonder is attention, fear, and pleasure all wrapped into one. Wonder. So wonder is an approach-prompting form of breathless attention that aggrandizes things, it elevates, it awes, and it mystifies. You can see with all these things, feeling awed, feeling mystified is both pleasurable and frightening at the same time. Now, what I want to do in the final little bit is talk about some predictions of this. Angelica and I have been working hard to try and provide evidence that would fall out of the hypothesis that wonder essentially involved in the aesthetic. And I have to report that a lot of this evidence has been carried out, or collected, I should say, this week. This is all hot off the presses. Some of it is not yet fully analyzed. So I just want to give you a flavor of some of the things that we're doing. So one prediction is that greatness should loom large. If you see something that you consider great art, then seeing it as great should make it seem, in some sense, bigger than it actually is, or it should make you assume that it's bigger then it would make you
Regardless
assume,
of the size.
regardless of the actual size. So let me give you an experiment. So we showed people big pictures and small pictures, same picture, but this is between subject design, so they either see the big one or the little one. And then we gave them a range of different questions about these pictures. So they just seen one or the other, but it's the same picture at different scales. And the bigger picture was judged to be more amazing, more awesome, less boring, more good, and more inspiring. And this was across 3 different images that we used.
Beautiful is missing on that list.
We didn't have the beautiful because I think this in contemporary art, people think beauty is passé, but it would be good to test beauty, especially given its sort of Kantian legacy. Okay, so here's another one where we presented people with different pictures, and we told people that these were the pictures of, I shouldn't say we because Angelica did all the work, but we told people that these were pictures of great masters, which they are. So you all have recognized this as Gorky, this is Malevich, and this as Matisse. And they either were told these were works by great masters or that they were works by unknown students. And then we asked them, how big do you think the picture is? And this is the actual DV, so they actually see this multiple choice. They have to guess on the size. And in another design, we showed people the same picture, same manipulation, either a student, or they're told it's a student or a master, and we're asked, how high would you hang it in a gallery? Which would be the good position to hang this picture? And for both the height and for the size, estimates were higher if they were told it was the work of a master. Another prediction, high art should be awesome. Well, what do I mean by high? This is, of course, a cheesy pun. Art should be more awesome if it's placed higher. So in a simple, this was done yesterday? Or 2 days? Angelica's like slept, she never sleeps because she's always collecting data, but this last week has been particularly, as you see, she's collecting data now. So out of your appreciation for all this beautiful new data, you should volunteer for her study during the breaks. So the same picture was presented to different subjects at different heights. And as you can see, it's a Miro picture, and they were asked to evaluate it. So for awe. So this is their awe judgment for the low picture, for the medium height, and for the high picture. So I'm not showing you p-values or anything. We don't have them. It's 0.01? Less than 0.01. So beautiful movement from the low to the mid, and high art is, of course, the most awesome of all. And the final body of work I'll mention to you, also being fairly quick, and I'm not going to show you actual data in this case, is a notion of magical thinking. So for those of you who know the disgust literature, there's a tremendously interesting literature associated with Paul Rosen that says there's this kind of transfer. Once you've touched something that's been in contact with something disgusting, you feel like it's disgusting too. People don't want to wear a sweater if they're told it belonged to Hitler. They don't want to take a drink from a cup that was used to transport urine, even though it's been sterilized, and so on. So they associate contact with the disgusting as disgusting. So there's a kind of magical transfer. And we think there's a magical transfer with greatness as well. So here's a thought experiment. Suppose the Mona Lisa burned down, or the terrible fire burned down. But the French were very smart. During the war, they didn't realize that they would just let Germany in, so they actually were worried about air raids, and they created a perfect duplicate, like just a perfect duplicate of the Mona Lisa, down to each and every scratch. And when the Mona Lisa burns down, they say, no problem, we'll just put the duplicate up. Okay, you've got 5 minutes at the Louvre. You got there at closing, they're about to shut down, and you don't have time to see both. You could either go see the ashes, or you could go see the duplicate. So how many of you would see the ashes? How many of you would see the duplicate? Okay, so a range of responses, but I hope some of you looked around. Let's take the vote again. So look around and get a sense of the numbers here. How many for ashes? How many for duplicate? Okay, so it's not that nobody wants to see the duplicate. Some of us are rational, but a lot of us are not.
What if you decided the Mona Lisa simply doesn't exist anymore and you simply go somewhere else in the museum and see something else?
I would recommend seeing lots of things over the Mona Lisa. For example, the Botticelli frescoes are much, much better, but that would just prove you're an art geek or a philosopher. So basically what we found, and this has been done with different samples, with a sample of art students, there was a 3-to-1 preference over looking at ashes over the work, which is in a way really surprising because art students could learn more from looking at the ashes. They want to be in contact with greatness,
The
And,
greatness is in the ashes.
the great, well, that's just what it is. So it's this kind of transfer. This thing has been, is rendered great. I'm going to sort of, we were going to run you as subjects on this. Do we want to?
I think they're too biased.
They're too biased now?
No,
Okay.
don't do it, run it.
Well,
Huh? We can run later.
okay.
Okay, I'm just going to skip this next slide because it's this was my final slide. Another study on magical thinking in the context of art, but it's an incentive for you to stick around to talk to us and to be victimized by Angelica, and I'll move straight to conclusions. So what I've tried to argue is that aesthetic judgment involves the emotions. I think we can make some progress on this basic claim by studying the nature of emotions, and I think in context of our environment, it's important to realize that emotions are fundamentally embodied. And while there may be a wide range of emotions that occur in the presence of art, the case can be made that this traditional emotion of wonder that's basically been neglected for the latter half of the 20th century might actually be a central aspect of aesthetic responsiveness. And I will stop there. I want to thank my collaborators, Kendall Eskin, Natalie is here, and Angelica refused to send me a picture, so I had to substitute with quite a chat. Okay, thank you all.